Welcome everyone to our next webinar about risk, cultivating a collaborative risk culture. And this is an interesting topic where we are hosting this time Charlotte Candy, who is a very experienced risk director. So welcome, Charlotte. Good to have you.
Thank you.
And discussing with Charlotte is our CEO Mikaeli Langinvainio. Good to have you, Miki, as well.
Thank you.
So before going into you can introduce yourselves in more detail, but before going into the actual topic, just a couple of practicalities. You have a chance to ask questions from our presenters in the Q&A section. We have closed the chat, but there's a Q&A section. So whenever you want to ask a question or comment on what's being discussed, please use the Q&A. And as mentioned also on the first slide already, we will be recording this session and we'll be sending this recording to you afterwards. But let's then go into the introductions. And Charlotte and Miki, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And hey, to start with a bit of our introductions, I think it's always important to understand what is our approach and sort of viewpoint to risk management as an art form or a discipline. So could you tell a little bit about, Charlotte, about your background and what kind of projects, organizations, industries you've been working with?
Of course I can. So I have quite a varied background. For a start, I have a legal, construction, quantity surveying background, risk, plus an MBA in strategy, particularly focusing on AI. So I have a blended education. I also have quite a range of topics that I have spoken on, I discuss quite regularly. So I'm really passionate about getting transformation in projects, getting projects from a poor risk culture to a positive risk culture. And this has been in organisations in rail, in highways, in nuclear power, nuclear decommissioning, where risk is a loaded question. It could be safety, it could be project risk. So very varied, and currently in aviation.
Nice. What a varied background in terms of the sort of academic background, but also practice. Well, the topic of today is the collaborative risk culture, indeed. And if we look at some of the standards like ISO 31000 and the wheel of principles, they have the principles of inclusion, human and cultural factors, including best available information, communicate and consult with the stakeholders. So it's clear there that you should definitely create a collaborative risk culture. But why is that important in your view? Why should we include stakeholders into risk management?
So if we have a better risk culture, we have process, we have procedure, but risk culture is the glue that sticks it all together. So if we don't have that, decisions are made in silos. People don't consider interdependencies. So if we have a better risk culture, we have better risk-made decisions. So it permeates everything that we do.
Sure. And I would also break down the sort of why into two brackets or baskets. Analytical reasons, on the other hand, why and how you can make better decisions, more informed risk awareness, but then also the human factors and the culture, indeed, how it supports the leadership and how the leadership supports risk management. And certainly some of the sort of key analytical principles that we have been finding out is that the world is moving fast. The complexity of issues from strategic, technological, environmental, social and so on, are increasingly complex and fast-paced. So the number of decisions and risks to be analyzed is ever growing in a sense. So you need to spread that workload and analytical workload somehow in the organization to keep up with everything. So that's certainly one of the points. And certainly the point about better decision making, it's well documented and research area that if you sort of identify the potential problems and take actions in a sort of a collaborative manner and even allow constructive disagreement in the decision making, it typically leads better outcomes and better decisions. Are those some of the things that you've been seeing or something else?
No, you're absolutely right. When we're trying to implement risk culture, we have to be really careful about some of our language that we use. So before we started this webinar, I was explaining to Mickey about an example of a very simple phrase, which means very different things to others, which is why a clear risk culture is important. So many of us, our role in risk management is to create a no surprises risk culture. But what does no surprises mean? To me, that means that we are open and honest and transparent, which aligns with IRM best practice for risk culture, etc. But those words can also be interpreted as bury the dead, hide it, we don't want to hear bad news, which also creates a very different risk culture. Neither risk culture is necessarily wrong. It's just about, is it informing the right decisions?
Sure. That's a great point, and also bind to that. I think that as risk management is a discipline of understanding uncertainties and doing foresight, analyzing possible obstacles, restrictions, problems, and uncertainties, there's a huge risk of confusion and miscommunication about the future if you don't engage people into the identification, assessment, analyzing the risk. So I think that actually the resistance in organizations often are caused more by confusion than the actual genuine opposition to what you are trying to reach. And I think that in that sense, risk management is a central piece of management and leadership all around, so that you can actually reduce the confusion and uncertainty that's what's sort of before us and sort of pave the way for the organization to actually perform. How do you see that?
So it is all about, there is an element of confusion, and it's because of the term risk a lot of the time. Like I said, I've worked in very different industries. Risk in a nuclear, in a rail sector is very much a safety focused consideration. You cannot use the same risk culture that you use for safety and critical life elements that you do for money and time. One is replaceable, one is not. And I think that's where people have their own biases towards what they see risk as. And frequently I've been told during my career, oh, well, don't you do health and safety? And I explain that my role is to help people forecast their futures and understand what the obstacles are clearer so that they're not caught off guard. But with there still being that confusion, there is also a lot of confusion about how risk culture can be developed.
Yeah, that's a great one. I've also been thinking about the sort of distance that different stakeholders have to the risk, and often quite a lot of expectations have been put on to the risk team or, the risk responsible running the sort of process in an organization or a project, and typically the risk team is somewhere in the middle, maybe sort of quite high, but somewhere in the middle. So they don't have the right distance to the strategic risk, and they don't have the right distance to the sort of frontline risk. So definitely the actual substance of risk management shouldn't be on that team that's actually enabling and capacitating and providing the tools and processes for it. But then again, sometimes you see that the frontline is not, for example, engaged into safety sort of analysis, and you have an expert that's actually trying to solve out what are the safety issues, and you don't really get the frontline viewpoints, or then the top management doesn't actually themselves consider properly the strategic risks and so on. How do you see sort of the difference between different stakeholders in terms of the distance to the risks?
So I've been really very fortunate throughout my career that I was a company risk manager for a government entity at one point.
Yeah,
And due to the volume of work and the size of the organisation, I had the ability to sit. I used to go and see the board on a monthly basis to understand what they wanted, but
yeah,
also we scaled our approach to risk management to what people needed. So
yeah,
the operatives on site did not need to know necessarily how the strategic risk was created, but they did need to know how their relationship was to helping us improve the situation. So it's really about considering the so what factor for your stakeholder,
yeah,
because someone on the site's workplace may not be as interested in the regulatory risks as someone who sits on the board where it could be their career at stake. We all have our own perspectives and our own expectations of what the risk process does for us. And if you scale it to the right person, it means that it's actually gives them something, it's a value add instead of something that takes value away from their day job.
Mhm. That's a great one. I know that you've been the head of risk at ACOM and probably seen quite a lot of different kind of organizations. Could you sort of share some lights on different kind of risk culture dynamics that you've been seeing across the board?
Yeah, where do we begin? Um, so it's very interesting 'cause the aviation sector, it very much depends on how they are funded. So
Yeah.
some airports in the UK and in Europe, they are semi-state. So they have government funding, but they have a commercial element. And with those two different approaches to operating an airport, for example, you if you've ever been to an airport lounge, that is something that the airport itself would quite like, but does it make money? It does for the airport, but not necessarily for the airlines. So you have to consider the appetite of the parties involved at the senior level. And
Mm.
also, they do such a wide range of activities, anything from operational risk to project risk. Some will have international regulations. There's a lot of components. But then you could go to something like a real estate high-rise development.
Mm.
They're privately funded. It's a very different approach to risk management because it's not about necessarily having a clear audit trail and everything with a check and balance. It will be about how much money, how much profit can we make versus how much the project costs. So
Mm.
there's lots of different variables between even public and private sector, as well as industries. The rail industry, defence, they have a really strong focus on risk management. They're two of the strongest industries, at least in the UK, for their risk management discipline because they deal with the general public, they use government money, and as a UK taxpayer, we all want value for money. So there's lots of dynamics. And as you'll see, the focus is less from what I've just been saying on the internal politics. It's more about the perception of others of that project or of that organisation.
That's a great one. I've also been taking part quite closely on a project level on hospital building projects, for example. And when you engage a lot of stakeholders, the architects, engineers, planners, even end users, surgeons and doctors to actually identify certain risks and sort of design options and so on, you truly have different tribe of people in the room. And
Yes.
you feel like, you really feel like that they all are super experts in their own field, and they understand risk and opportunity and everything in a different way that they truly have hard time sometimes communicating each other's, their own viewpoints to each other, as some are more creative. The architects typically are more creative and artsy type of people, and
Yeah.
then engineers are thinking about the technicalities and so on. So that's kind of interesting. Have you noted that the sort of academic or background of professional background of the stakeholders also affect some of the work?
Yes. So I have also worked in I've done hospitals, and universities are actually very, very interesting.
Mm,
Because your stakeholders are professors and academics that are sometimes well-renowned in their profession,
mm,
but they've never built something or they've never worked in a construction project, and they have their wish list of what they see things as. And it could be that they see it sometimes. I think the best description I once had is issues management. Oh, apparently issues management isn't a thing. I said, okay, they're problems. We're being very dramatic, and it's about terminology. So I would say for anything, whether you're dealing with academics, site operatives, everyone, you have to be really clear about your definition of what you're talking about. So I always start workshops and sessions with a clear session on this is what I mean by risk. I mean threats and opportunities. And by an issue, I mean something that is harming us right now. Just because it makes the experience a lot easier for everyone if we're all on the same page from the start.
That's a really good pointer to take, and always sort of ensure and do not assume that everybody understands the terminology like you do after like 20 years of risk management. That's a good pointer. But coming to the sort of more human reasons of why to include stakeholders in risk management, certainly we want to get better commitment and ownership on those risks and the management of them. But what role do you see leadership and management should play in establishing a risk culture?
They are some of the most important individuals. The tone from the top is so important, because at the end of the day, if your boss doesn't care about risk, why would you? It's very, very, very important. And where I've had most success is when actually we trained the whole board in this is the fundamentals of risk management that they needed for their role, and that they could see the cascade effect of how it worked in their team. And then we managed to convince them that every employee had an objective in their appraisal to apply the risk management process to their projects. So we had firstly a warm fuzzy, you've got the board wanting to do this, but you've got the stick of it's in your appraisal now. If you would like a bonus, you need to do it more than lip service. You couldn't just, I've been to one workshop, I'm good. We would ask them to demonstrate. So the carrot being the bonus, the stick being, if you don't, it's in your appraisal now, you actually have to do it. And there is always going to be a little bit of resistance to start with. But then once people realise, actually, it's not that scary and it's not that difficult to involve yourself in the risk process, you're not necessarily going to be responsible for everything. People started to come along on the journey.
Yeah, one great point is I would also sort of add that leadership often needs, especially sort of collaborative risk culture, requires a certain level of leadership mindset of sharing also the transparency and vulnerability of the organization to sort of upcoming challenges or uncertainties and risks, because that actually creates then a culture where you show trust in your team's ability to actually proactively solve those problems and handle those risks. And often when you can introduce an efficient and reliable process how to engage people into risk management, there's actually a huge weight, lift from the shoulders of the leaders when they can see that, okay, my team is actually handling this properly, and not just as a sort of compliance exercise or ticking the box type of exercise, but genuinely caring about the company, about the project, and taking care of the stuff. So that's super important. And maybe sort of one thing to consider for the leaders is that, who are affected by the risks and who are affecting the risks as well. So if you open with the uncertainties, you can create more, prepared organization for possible changes and also impacts of negative impacts of the risks. But then, of course, on seizing the opportunities as well as threats. So those are some of the considerations.
Well, I have an excellent story to tell you about something that I think more leaders should consider. It's horizon scanning.
Okay, good.
And if anyone's interested, it is also a more colourful version of it is on my LinkedIn profile as a little story.
Nice.
Horizon scanning is really, really important, but with many competing objectives, people sort of put it to one side. So this is an example from quite a while ago. I proudly decided I'm going to get the board to do horizon scanning. So I went in, I'd prepared, and they said, this seems like a waste of time. So I said, okay, let's come up with some, and at this point in time, I thought they were completely ridiculous ideas. I said, how about Brexit happens? What does that mean to our business? What happens if Donald Trump becomes president because we had an American element to our organisation? And I said, and finally, we've got a general election coming up at that point. And I said, what if Jeremy Corbyn becomes our prime minister and he has quite a strong view on nuclear power and nuclear projects? And I was told, don't be so silly. You've come up with some very, very ridiculous ideas. And I went off and I did some risk mapping and did all the good things that a good risk manager should do. And I went on holiday the day that we got the results for the Brexit vote. And on the Monday morning, when I returned to the office after having a lovely weekend in Copenhagen, I was asked by the managing director at the time, could we come and have a little chat about that discussion a few months ago about Brexit and its impact? And I was able to sit there with great confidence and say, this is how I've mapped it out. It doesn't affect you at this moment in time, but you need to consider these things for future. Later in the year, also, Donald Trump, I believe, became president.
Yeah.
So I would say sometimes we have to scare people into action.
Yeah.
I couldn't make up that scenario if I tried.
Yeah, that's a really great example. We actually also have conducted scenario analysis with our clients and basically summarizing 4 scenarios: Harris getting elected and Trump getting elected, and 4 scenarios: good Trump versus bad Trump, good Harris versus bad Harris, and 4 different futures for the world. Unfortunately,
yes.
And unfortunately, we are seeing some of the elements from the bad Trump now unfolding, but we will not know how deep into bad we will go before we go to the better Trump. But we'll see. But certainly some of those organizations who did that exercise with us are much more prepared now for what's unfolding at the moment. So scenario analysis and horizon scanning certainly are often quite missing pieces of risk management processes, I would say, but seeing more and more those because the fact is that risk management cannot handle the unforeseen scenarios, and the sort of preparedness for let's say high altitude risk scenarios are not necessarily always relevant to be broken down into individual manageable risks, but rather to be treated as scenarios. But great points. Some of the considerations about sort of leadership roles is as well that we've seen that some of the best organizations really tend to hire polar opposites when it comes to knowledge. They have people who really know their stuff, but don't necessarily know what the others know. And if you truly are working with professionals, there's always a risk of certain level of conflict as well, or at least analytical disagreements. And also nature builds diversity in us. We are different by psychological profile and of course our background expertise and an environment that we grew up in, and everything, our risk sort of appetite and so on is different. So some of the sort of key elements of collaborative risk culture in my view is to understand that diversity, even though you wouldn't get always the best possible risk analysis through collaboration, but you then at least understand how people understand the risks and that they understand each other's viewpoints better. So it's actually risk management can be also a leadership tool beyond just, let's say, just a risk management of certain topics, let's say. So how do you feel about that?
Well, it's really important when we're facilitating to understand the whys. Lots of people will, depending on your type of workshop, you may have someone who's a very strong character, and they may have some really strong views on a matter. And I've had this before. I've done a risk analysis, and I've said to them, I don't think your top risk is correct. And they're like, no, you don't understand. I've had a really bad time. I couldn't get people on site. I had security pass issues, all of this. And I said, okay, can I ask which project? Oh, my last one. And when did that finish? Oh, 6 weeks ago. I said, okay. And then we were able to unpack when it had happened. So there was a whole recency thing. So it was front of mind. This is my problem. I said, okay, then let's take it a step further. Which elements were a problem? And it was actually one profession. And I said, then in that case, we are overstating the risk profile by you putting as your top risk. It's one person, and it's one person quite late in the project. So maybe we can mitigate this by, we had that problem last time, let's learn the lesson. But very often, because of people's bad experiences on a project previously, they start adding bias into their risk numbers. So they might pad out numbers because, well, last time it cost me a lot of money. But what happens? So we always have to ask why people have that experience. And if people are far too positive, always ask them, have you ever done this activity? It's easy to be positive when you've never done it before.
Yeah, that's a great point. I see also risk management as a sort of form of conflict prevention in the sense that some of the risk elements in, let's say, collaborative or sort of integrated project types or alliance projects, construction projects, and so on, there's inherent sort of a possibility and potential for conflict. And you can certainly sort of manage some of those potentials for conflict in a proactive manner. And one thing is for sure that you can't handle the conflict alone. You can't solve a conflict. You can't mediate a conflict alone. So in a sense, you can't prevent it alone. So you need to actually have the stakeholders involved in discussing those potential problems in front of them. Do you have anything to say on that?
So you need to really understand what their point of view is. What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Because the more information, like you said earlier, the more information we have, the better we can actually assist. So conflicts, if you can understand what the concerns are of all the parties, you can probably get some allies of saying, actually, if we do this approach, we can offset it by using these parties here. So you can start getting people to collaborate by actually resolving a conflict. But it does very much take a deep understanding of the stakeholders that are actually joining the session.
Sure, that's a great point. It requires more maybe from the facilitator. But my point actually is that the stakeholders don't necessarily consciously even know which of the risks are actually potential conflicts before they actually eventuate. So it's
we
better
all have
to
our
manage.
own blinkered view of our view is the right view.
Exactly, and if the sort of collaboration around risks is not facilitated well, or you don't have structured tools to facilitate the process and take people from point A to B and to C and so on, there is definitely a risk of sort of creating friction and stifle the creativity of people and sort of fuel conflict if you let people to discuss matters of critical importance and tension without good facilitator or without good processes. And often if the stakeholders just simply use wrong words, they are,
language is so important.
Yep. They're triggering each other's sort of stress responses, and people's heart rates are, pumping up, and their thinking get clouded, and you get this conflict behavior in some of the cases. And I see that in a good, well-facilitated process, you ensure that everybody can share their viewpoints and their understanding of the context together, and sort of set their own let's say, agenda on the table and their own interpretation of what's possible and what's not, and so on. So in that sense, I see that that risk management is actually a great tool for leadership to actually embed into many processes, because it's so structured way how to handle human interaction. It's almost the same than in mediation of conflicts, where you first identify what are the issues, how should we understand these, what is the importance, what is the effect on different parts of the organization. We analyze it together, what should we do about it, and so on. And then you start doing monitoring. Risk management is actually a very good conflict prevention tool if you want to see it that way. How do you feel about it?
Ooh, so I think there's positive and negatives of the pandemic. We started using digital tools as second nature, which was great. But sometimes when it comes to facilitation, you cannot read people's body language that well in this small little square. It sometimes becomes quite challenging because, like you said, like conflict management. I can't necessarily see if someone's 100% happy. So how I have to deal with this now when I'm doing meetings, if we don't do them in person, put your camera on. Because even if you don't know it, your body language, even in the small square, will give it away. Because we have to look for these non-verbal cues even more now to understand people's approach. I've been apparently known to be able to actually mediate a workshop just by my facial expression. The words were, I don't think the risk manager's very happy with our approach to this. So you can still do it remotely. I just think that you need to really, really do your homework on the parties and the issues to really get to the bottom of it, because it could be masked by just turning a camera off.
Truly, and some of the signs of sort of raising tensions is often silence or violence. So either people tend to get cold and really shut up, and or then they try to attack with some sort of verbal show of force, or then from the facilitator or the leadership, you also see the sort of expression or suppression that they either let you express or then suppress you. So I think that risk management, when it's done properly and you can engage and ensure that all the stakeholders' viewpoints are heard, some digital tools like Inclus can help a lot in that actually, so that you can ensure that you got all of the viewpoints and everybody's sort of understanding on the table before you actually start the dialogue. And then people have better, let's say, safer space.
It takes the heat out of the environment, and I completely understand that challenge, because if you're asked on the spot, give me 3 risks,
exactly,
you already know, you can already feel that, which 3. Whereas if like using tools really does help get the data together, and it gives slightly shyer members of the group the forum to put a view forward that may be very unpopular if done in person, but it gives them the ability to do it and explain their point of view.
That's a great
Hey
point.
guys, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so would you like to take them now relatedly to this discussion? Like one is, what, if I read it correct, what is the maximum of people to work with for a live successful facilitation workshop?
Okay,
that's a question.
That's quite a question. So what I would say, it always helps. I quite like to take an assistant with me if I'm facilitating in person, mainly because I cannot facilitate and note take. I accept my challenges, which means that I can then manage a larger group of people. So I would say never exceed 20 in person. I have done the facilitation of that many, but if you're going to do that technique, put them into groups of 4 or put them into 2s. You need to break them down into groups to make them slightly more manageable. It is possible, but in person, there's a lot more distractions. So you just need to be really, really conscious of it. And I always have a set of ground rules. And my favourite ground rule is be present or be gone. If you're not interested, if you're distracted by your phone, your laptop or anything, I'd rather you didn't attend. And it may sound incredibly harsh, but it means that the experience for everyone else who's in the room is not disrupted.
Yeah, that's a good point. Then another question, again, reading out loud. Do you know a company or case that has centralized into a repository problems occurring in the various departments and takes them as an information source for risk management?
I can think of many companies and practitioners, I would say, actually myself. We do that. Lessons learned and issues from other departments are like they're like oil. We want them. As we keep saying, in the digital era, data is so important. It's like gold, oil. We need it. The more data we have, the stronger we can be in our views, and it means we create better quality risk registers. I was going to say, and I'm sure your product as well helps with the process.
I'd like to say the same. Okay, I'm seeing that there's more questions coming in. That's great. Keep them coming. Maybe we can address one more and then go ahead with the agenda that we had. And we will make sure towards the end that we'll try and address all questions. And if we don't have time to address all of them here, we will do that afterwards and send the answers to you, like back to you with the recording as well. So keep them coming. So here's the third one. Do you have any suggestions for measuring risk culture? That's a good question. Not only risk training attendance, but metrics which are more meaningful / add value.
So I'm just jumping in with all these questions, sorry. So what I would recommend is the Association of Project Management, management of risk, all these qualifications, they also have a risk maturity matrix, which is how you would start assessing your culture. So you'd look at what your processes are, what people do, etc. And you could start to create an idea, and it could be very flexible to what you need. But that would be able to show position from beginning to end. And I've used that technique on improving risk culture in rail projects. So is the process being used? Are people trained? Because actually attendance at training is probably a very bad metric, because I've attended numerous training courses. Does that mean that your culture has improved? No, because culture is just what people do when you're not around. It's not something you can tick a box and you've got it. So I would suggest something like that, and it's quite, you can create your own matrix, use those topics to create sort of some guidelines, and then you could actually start scoring them from 1 to 5, very much like a risk process, and just sort of start making some quantitative data behind it of what do you want to achieve and how are you going to get there.
Julia, maybe I can add on that we have actually created a risk maturity analysis with the ISO 31000 principles. So how does they reflect in your organization? Things like how well you integrate risk management into decision making, how structured, comprehensive it is. Are you customizing it actually to your company's just goal landscape and sort of context of your industry? Do you develop it continuously? Are you taking into consideration different human and cultural factors, and so on and so on? So those are a little bit more, let's say, softer metrics, but certainly something that are revealing often quite important things about your risk management culture if you just consider through those. And we often provide a free maturity assessment for any organization to do that, because it's fairly lightweight. You can engage easily people to give their views on it, and you can do it in 15 minutes, have the discussion about it in 15 minutes. Of course, you can spend more time and should maybe, but those maturity assessments shouldn't necessarily be that difficult to do. You just have to consider them a little while. Yeah, great questions. I have a few more questions to Charlotte. Maybe we come back to the Q&A in a bit. But talking about the sort of how to engage people efficiently, you mentioned already that there's different kind of sort of experience on people and personalities, and some people are extroverts, some are introverts, and that affects how they actually participate. Some are busy, some are not busy. You have different knowledge. So there's various perspectives of various views or let's say differences why the different stakeholders are seeing the risk differently. Do you have a sort of take on that? How much sort of personality or individual thinking affects how they affect assessing risk, for example?
So there's two sort of clear topics there.
Yeah.
Firstly, we have individual basis, which
Yeah.
is like you've already discussed, how we're brought up. A lot of what happens in our childhood and our working life creates our perceptions. But we have these cognitive biases that we cannot, under any circumstances, remove. They're just the way we are. They are from elements of our life, etc. And as a good risk manager, you don't try and fix them. You can't fix people's cognitive biases, but you acknowledging that they exist and understanding why they exist helps you be a better facilitator, and it helps with the implementation, because there's no point trying to implement a risk management process with someone who is like completely adverse risk because it didn't work on their last project. Find out why it didn't work. Let's go down that route. Don't just I've got a cookie cutter set of risk management processes and I'm going to do them to you. People don't like risk being done to them. They like to feel that they chose to be involved in the process. So
yeah, that's
there's lots of bias.
What's your favorite bias?
I do sadly have a favorite bias. I know there's hundreds of them, and I don't even know if it's an official one, but it's called the IKEA bias. If you go on Wikipedia, I think it's on there. Essentially, people put a lot of weight in things they've made themselves, even if they look terrible. So, like, we put our IKEA furniture together, and it doesn't matter that we've got 6 parts left at the end. We think we've finished, we think it's amazing, until 2 weeks later when it doesn't do what it should do because we didn't follow the instructions. But we have such a sense of achievement in what we've done that we think it's so much better than it possibly is.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite?
Well, my favorite perhaps is optimism bias, that people tend to, on average, be more optimistic than the real circumstances would allow you to consider. For example, people don't consider that they are as likely to get into a car accident than their neighbor who just got severely injured, for example, and that's something that we just don't see happening. But then again, on optimism bias, there's also the positive side of it, that the people who have more optimism, maybe even not that well justified, they tend to be better off actually maneuvering through challenges and risks when they realize. So that builds resilience and agility to act and maneuver when the risks are realizing. So
if they're only a little ill-informed to how they got there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another one maybe is that, I don't know if it's a bias, but there was a study in a UK university, I don't remember which one, but on a bystander effect, that they started to pump sort of smoke into a room and then checked how many students are leaving the room. And there was a tipping point that when like 20 people were running out, then everybody ran out.
Yeah, we are
yeah,
strange as human beings.
yeah. And if you sort of consider now what's happening with democratic institutions in the West, we are seeing quite a lot of probably sort of bystander effect in many cases, but I'm certain that at some point we have a tipping point of we are seeing mass protests and sort of possible unrest and so on in the streets of Europe and US as well, because we are now in the stage of the bystander effect in many cases. And then on the other hand, if we consider, for example, financial risk taking, Warren Buffett, who has now admitted actually making some mistakes, but lately, but he's emphasizing the importance of psychological discipline. So actually working against the crowd, that actually you should trust your own long-term vision and confidence in your own analysis, no matter what the other people say in the market. So those are kind of interesting biases. But certainly there are so many.
The other problem, though, it's not an individual bias. Groupthink. That is the biggest challenge when you get a lot of people from the same sector or people who've been in the role a very long time. The rail industry has people who've got double digits their whole career in one sector. Groupthink can seep in if that's how we've always done it, and that's something else that you have to look out for as a risk manager. Why are we doing it this way? Why is the culture this way? If it's because we've always done it that way, but the world has changed a lot in the last 5 years, I think we can challenge that's not so anymore.
Truly, we tackle that problem in Inclus risk processes often, that we allow space for individual thinking first, and then we collect those viewpoints, and then we start discussing about the sort of group view on those risks, and sort of balancing out the individual assessments, and then maybe selecting the final risk score and so on after the individual thinking happening. And now the use of AI is actually you can use it first to maybe even to use it to extract real life evidence based on academic research articles, claims data, or any other databases you might have, so that you start with something real. Then humans and individuals can brainstorm on top of those risks, and then we can have a group session. And then again, we can use AI to fill in the blind spots. We can prompt the AI to actually see where our blind spots are, and use it as a sort of a devil's advocate, that are we seeing this and this. So I think we have more than enough tools to manage groupthink, but we just have to be deliberate about it, how to actually facilitate the process, because you can ruin it by doing the groupthink and then anchoring to the groupthink first. So you have to break down the process.
Absolutely. I would say just acknowledging that groupthink could be there is you're in the right direction. Believing that everyone's got independent opinions and there won't be any bias is only going to set you up for an interesting chat later down the line when models or risk profiles don't look quite how people anticipated.
Certainly. There's a couple of more questions in the Q&A. Maybe we can take those.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if, because also looking at the time, so we're approaching the end. So let's take this. So let's go with this one first, since it relates to the optimism bias. Would you consider it useful to balance risk discussion with the discussion about opportunities, or would you rather keep these two separated in order to avoid biases such as optimism bias?
This is the skill of a great facilitator to try and balance the biases. But I would actually recommend do both in the same session. That is not a problem. But actually start with opportunities. Humans naturally will always defend themselves. We're very good at it. But we're not very good at looking for opportunities. So I try and start my risk workshops looking for opportunities, but also being very clear with people about what we see as an opportunity. In my projects, if it doesn't save me money or get me more money, and it doesn't save me time, I don't care if it gets another department or another element of the project that I'm not working in extra money. It is not our opportunity to manage. So people are very good at finding other people's opportunities, less so their own. But that's how I would do it. Start with opportunities and then go on to your threats or risks.
Good point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would add that the risk sort of as a term often is considered as the negative impact of uncertainty or purely a threat, and certainly risk is covering both threat and opportunity, like Charlotte said. So definitely it should always be present in whatever we are doing, because also evaluating the opportunity that's inherent in a risk, we then have a better ability to understand, what is our risk appetite in that particular topic, for example, and what we want to do with that risk in terms of also maximizing the opportunities that are within it. So and we have certainly topics which are more of threats or more of opportunities, but there's a bunch of things which are both at the same time, the threats and opportunities, and you should definitely find those and understand those well. We often see that you start with threat registry, but then it's also often well argued that you should focus on opportunities sort of to fill in the more threat approach that has been relevant in many organizations. But probably no wrong or right way to do it, because it's so much about the context that we're talking about, whether we want to look at threats or opportunities or both. But great question.
Yeah. Let's take another one. So, what is your view on referring to issues as incidents during risk management workshops?
I would say it's context dependent. I would say in projects, it is an issue, but that's because that's how we could deal with it in project environments, etc. If it's safety related, safety tends to be interpreted generally as incidents. So that's why it's really clear about making, as long as everyone has the same understanding, I'm not going to be militant about what terms you use, because some people use risk and opportunity. I like threats and opportunity, current and target. We all have our terminology for the sector we work in. As long as there is a clear understanding of what we mean, it's not necessarily a problem. But my choice is to use issue versus incident, because it's associated very often with safety, and in an airport environment you'd have a security incident, a safety incident, whereas on the project we would have an impacted risk being an issue.
Truly, and what I see that there's a untapped source of risk information, let's say in incident archives, because they are often dealt with as individual issues or incidents, and the corrective actions are directed into individual incidents. But if we use AI, for example, to actually go through all the past incidents, we might see trends in our safety culture or security culture at large and so on. So I think that there's definitely not necessarily an overlap, but synergies between incident processes and risk management processes that should be always explored. But a great question as well.
Then we actually have one that we received beforehand, like in advance, and I'll read it from my phone if you don't mind. Are there special requirements in collaborative risk culture coming out of the NIS2 directive?
I was going to say, I don't know the answer, I'm afraid.
The NIS2 directive, we do have a template for it. We have experts working on it with the Cyber Association of Finland that we are also part of, and there's a national implementation directive or plan or guidelines of Finland developed for NIS2. Certainly there's always the element of leadership commitment and stakeholder engagement in all information security frameworks, including the NIS2. But certainly it's looking at the gaps of the cybersecurity environment, and then the controls that are often technical, but then there's a lot of issues which are non-technical. So you have both sort of kind of risks often emerging from information security, both technical and human centric, and certainly there is need for stakeholder engagement. But yeah, we do have a template. I think it has around 100 topics in the NIS2 template, and we can share it to anybody who's interested in that particular template. So we can have a discussion if you want around NIS2 separately as well. But good question. I would like to ask still from Charlotte that often the sort of when there's a goodwill of the management to engage stakeholders in risk management, and if you engage people and create initial sort of enthusiasm on the process and collaboration, but then because in risk management you have quite many stages and you should do it in a continuous and repeatable manner, often the sort of initial goodwill is then dying out without proper tools and actually sort of consistency and commitment to the teamwork and the process itself. Have you seen that the sort of tools like Inclus could actually help you to maintain the collaborative risk process, not only start it.
Absolutely. So I would say that tools like Inclus are useful for the start and throughout the process because it's a check-in point for the team. And it keeps the momentum. And for a lot of organizations, it's not Excel. And that will just make it a little bit more engaging. And I know what you're really asking, Ricky. Well, of course, you can play games and you can basically gamify some of the activities to encourage engagement. But I think that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe also the nudge technique that you've been speaking about, it's also interesting. Maybe we can actually have another session on that.
Yes, absolutely.
And also wanted to discuss on sort of what kind of risks typically tend to require more collaboration than others, but we can save those to maybe a next time, and we will collect some of these questions, and we can send out a summary on the key findings from this webinar also in written format to you all, so you can revisit them if you want later as well. But really, thank you so much, Charlotte, coming and joining us. It was truly a pleasure, and I learned a lot from your experience, and waiting for the next talk definitely. Irmel, do you want to say a couple of words about the upcoming webinars and other stuff?
Sure. Yeah. We are like regularly organizing these webinars, and next up will be psychological resilience, which is very topical at these times. So that's going to be on April the 8th, and you can follow the QR code and sign up already if you like. And then equally, you can also contact Charlotte through the QR code. And if you'd like to see a demo of Inclus, you can again follow this QR code. But thank you so much for attending, and we will be sending you the recording afterwards, and looking forward to seeing you again in the next webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, then the next one will be interesting. We have Juhani Mäkinen, a former Navy Special Forces operator, talking about the psychological resilience. So please do join, and have a nice week and day, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.